Hello and welcome again. In this lesson, we are going to have a quick introduction to the use of functions. We will have a section on lessons about the use of classes and object-oriented programming and functions in the coming sections. But for now, I thought it would be useful if we get a basic introduction to what functions are and why do we use them and how do we essentially use them and iterate them, because we have been using them for a while and now it kind of makes sense that we know a little bit more about them. So functions are essentially the functioning part of an object. An object could have properties such as when you have a label, that label has a property called text, but also could have functions that does things for us. We will talk about this in more details in the future, but for now we need to know how do we use them. So let's jump back into Xcode. And for this project, I'm actually going to use an iOS application simply because the way that we write functions in command line tools is a little bit different than the ones that we do in iOS applications. And the command line is a little bit out of the scope of this course essentially. So I'm going to make a new iOS single view application and I'm going to call it Functions iOS app. So let's see what do we mean by functions. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go to my viewcontroller.m, and as you remember, we can clear a lot of this out. So we have a cleaner and tidier, code, not very overwhelming. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say nslog hello. So what this does is very similar to a command line tool. When the app compiles and the application essentially launches in the simulator, we will see the command debug console, then that's going to show us the value that we tried to print. So now down in here, it says hello, which is perfect. Don't worry about that little thing up there. That's a machine printed, thing. If you have that, depending on the application and the version of the simulator that you're using, you might see different things, but this is the thing that we are saying. Now here I want to add a new function. Let's see how do we do that, and then I'm going to explain what it does. I'm going to call this one my function, and this is what my function does. It does this, nslog hello. So I currently have a new function in my project, essentially in the implementation of view controller. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. We will talk about this in far more details in the future. But I have a new function, which is actually quite similar to view.load. You see, it has a dash void view.load. I have a dash void my function. And to call that, I'm going to say self, which means this current file, this current ID, my function. So now I'm calling the function from self. So what do you think is going to happen? When I run this application now, when I relaunch it, view.load is going to happen because that's the one that happens by default. And in that default, it's going to say, well, go and find this function and run it. And it finds this function and says hello, which is exactly what we expected. Now let's get a sense of what the function is and how it works. Every function essentially has these few things in it. I'm going to write them in comments. So it has a dash that shows it is not a constructor. We will talk about this in the future. Let's imagine there is always a dash. And then within the parentheses is the return type. It says, what does this function return for us? And then there is a name of the function. And then there is a column, an optional column, and then there is an argument type, and then there is an argument name, and this continues. Let's see what I have written. It seems a little bit complicated. It actually is not. It's saying that there is a return type. What does this one return? My function doesn't return anything. Its return type is void. It just does something. It's not like my function is meant to calculate some values and give me a number. It's simply meant to print hello. And then it's saying, what's the name of the function? That's the one. And then some optional arguments. Are there any arguments that you want to enter into it? Now let's see a function that has an argument. So I'm going to go in here. So I'm going to write again void, and in void I'm going to say my new function that has an entry of the type NSString, and I'm going to call it input. So let's see what this one means. It means there is a function called my new function and it receives something called input. So here is how we're going to call that. We're going to say self my new function, and it says, hey, you have to feed me an NSS string. I'm going to say, okay, that NSS string is Amir. So now this function receives something, but we haven't really done anything in here, which we call the body of the function. Body of the function. We haven't done anything in here. How about we print that? So we say nslog print whatever you find in input. So whatever is the value that someone has fed into this function gets into the nslog and gets printed. Let's see if that works. Okay, so it says hello, and then the other function, this one, prints Amir. That's the one. Now, bear with me for a few minutes. It will become a lot more, a lot easier to understand. Now I'm going to clean or delete all of these functions, and I'm going to have a function that when you give it a number, it returns the square of it. So I'm going to call it void a square function, and my square function receives an integer. Let's call it input again. And what does it do? It says int res result is input multiplied by input, that is a square value of something, and nslog, and in the nslog it says a square is, what is it? It is going to be res. So whoever calls this function and gives it a value, it will calculate the square of it and it will print it for us. Let's try it. In the trying, I'm going to say self a square function of 8, and let's run it. And now I have it saying a square is 64, exactly like how I expected. Now let's have another function that we give it two numbers and it tells us which one is larger. So I'm going to delete all of these again. I'm going to say I have a void, and in my void, which is bigger, these are obviously names I'm coming up myself, int a and b, and that is going to be and int b. These are essentially tags. You don't really need them, but when you want to separate your arguments, you have to put a space between them. Every argument needs to know what is its type. In here, both of them are integer. Maybe you're writing something that one of them is integer, one of them is a string. I should, however, mention, and maybe I should have said this a little earlier, this lesson isn't for you to learn how to write functions. We will get there in the future. This lesson is for you to understand how functions are being called and why do we use functions in general. So don't worry overly about the ins and outs of the functions. We will get there in a few sections from now. So in any case, if I receive an A and a B, I'm going to say if A is larger than B, then nslog, whatever is the value in A is larger, and that is A. Else, nslog, whatever is the value is larger in B, of course. So let's see how we can call this. In my viewDidLoad, which is the method or the function that runs by default, function that runs at the view load time, I'm going to say self which is bigger, 5 and 15. And if we run this code now, it's gonna take a little while and then it's gonna tell us 15 is larger because it's calling that function. Now, like I said, the exact details of how do we use functions or how do we write our own functions is going to come up sometime in the future. What is important right now is understanding that how do we call functions, and we do it using the bracket operations in Objective-C. In Swift and other languages, we do it slightly differently. Now, I want to show you some of the functions we have been using forever now. One of them is if I would say my name is equal to a string, and then that other string is Adam, for instance. So that is essentially a function for NS string. So just like for now, in view controller, I added my own function. Somebody has programmed something that is called is equal to a string that receives an NS string, just like in here, and it returns a value that is Boolean. Our functions didn't return anything, they were void, but that function essentially returns something. Let's see another one. Another one would be NS string mystr, and that is going to be NS string with format. Again, this is a function somebody has programmed it somewhere out there. Or another one would be NS dictionary, my dictionary is NS dictionary with objects and keys, for instance. Again, a function that somebody has programmed for us, and that is how we call it. And when we call it, it tells us, well, there is an argument that you have to feed me. So with that in mind, let me just quickly recap this. Here is again the same thing I had written earlier on. So return type, that is return type, function name, optional column, argument type, argument name. That is how a function is produced, and that is how we use it. Again, we will be writing functions in more details in the future, but for now, when you're using functions, keep your eye on the types that is returning and the arguments that it's accepting. For instance, if you have something like NS mutable string mystr, and that is going to be an NS mutable string, a string with a string, you see it says its instance type return. So whatever is its own type, it will return the same thing. It will return an NS mutable string, and it needs a non-null NS string. So you have to feed me with an NS string. So if I do that, I say, well, I have to give you a value, something, doesn't matter what, but it cannot be null. It has to have an actual value in there. So keep an eye on those, and you get more familiarity and you get more confidence in dealing with functions and calling methods and from different objects in your iOS programming. So that's about that. Let's keep it up to here, and we'll move on to our next lesson, which is actually a very interesting exercise.